Okay. Those of us who actually deal with routers, and that should, or at least once upon a time, used to be the majority of the people who came to these meetings, have a problem these days of 300 people all banging on the world and how you manage your routers and so on and so forth. And the last couple of meetings, people have been whining about what tools are out there. So the purpose of this session is to talk about tools so that you know where your routers are tonight and what they're doing and when they're doing, when they've changed. And the panelists are to talk about one tool known quite nicely, since we have sex acts, as rancid, are John Heasley of RouteFuse and Verio, and Hank Kilmer of Terrapin Communications Architecture and Consulting Firm, and Danny McPherson from Arbor, and essentially two sets of tools, rancid and something I can't figure out why called tool. And so first we're going to do, I think, Hank, you're going to do the song and dance for you and He's. And this is a tool commonly used by some of the very large ISPs, et cetera, to try to figure out where your router is tonight.
So Randy asked me to talk about Rancid, which is a tool, not to be confused with your tool, but I don't want to talk about your tool. I first developed the core of Rancid back in the early 90s, and for years and years and years, John's been the main maintainer of it. But it's a useful tool, and so let's go over what it does. In a nutshell, it works on grabbing your configuration, and it grabs more than just the actual router configuration. It tries to grab things about the hardware, any serial numbers it can grab, the software that's running, and store it in a CVS repository. It's written in programming languages that are portable and that are somewhat gross, if you've ever looked at some of the expect in it, but easily hackable for people who want it to do different things. It keeps all the information in CVS repositories, so you can get history and diffs and other useful tools that deal with CVS. And it has man pages, which is a bonus for tools whipped together to solve purposes. So it has a control script that goes through a list of your routers, and the list of your routers basically is just the router name and the vendor and whether it's up or down. And it will run through that list and run a whole bunch of various commands. After logging into the router, run a whole bunch of various commands, parse that output, because you don't always want some of the output, some of it changes, NTP clocks, stuff like that. And stores it in your CVS repository, mails a diff to a mailing list, so whomever wants to be on that list or can get it. You can also divide this up into groups, so if you have someone working on your edge routers versus your core routers, you can divide it up, different people see the diffs, useful things like that. And then check it into CVS where you have your repository. To get the tool working, or Rancid working, it uses autoconfig, so it's pretty straightforward to set up. You config and make and install. It's in the various FreeBSD port structures and stuff like that, so installing it's pretty easy. And when you run into problems, there's man pages, which is, again, useful. So when you install it, you get to track your configs, which is more than what a lot of networks do out there, but incredibly useful. You get to track hardware changes. If a card was pulled and another one put in, it will tell you. It will tell you if your power supply vanishes. So it's useful for that as well. It will tell you what software you're running. You'll know if your NOC upgraded software or something like that. And so it is useful for not only tracking but also recovering. You have your config. You know what should be on the router. If you need to rebuild the router from scratch, you have a copy to put in there. But the concept of Rancid was born after I had a whole bunch of tools that kind of did pieces of this, and then I glued it together. So what you get is more than just the config repository. You get login scripts and other scripts that you can use to help maintain your network. There was a time when I had to roll out, access lists to 100 plus routers, and can do that in a matter of seconds with tools like PAR and the login scripts that come with Rancid. PAR parallelizes the process. So once you have your Rancid installed in your configs, there's more that you can use this for to automate and speed up your operations and help your engineers know what to do. There are also some utilities that come along with Rancid that people have written and feel free to share, and we accept other updates to this list as well, but there's a looking glass included, so you can easily roll out a looking glass on your network if you wish. There are examples of how to reuse some of the scripts that come with it, like the login scripts, and do little pieces of expect to load config bits and stuff like that. And it's really a stepping stone to more automation. So we love automation. So write and share. So in addition to Rancid, since it is a stepping stone, other people have written tools that use its repositories and use some of its structure. And our friends over at ISC and Joe, who's going to speak here in particular, has done a lot of work on tools that will build topology maps for your network and generate DNS files and things like that, as well as some consistency checks. Do you have a BGP setup here? Is the corresponding router have the same setup? Stuff like that. So, we encourage that kind of work. We like to share it, and Joe's done a good job. You can find Rancid at shrubbery.net, which is hosted by Heasley. And the ISC tools were from a previous nanog, or mentioned on a previous nanog. You can find them there as well as on the ISC page. That's mainly it for Rancid. Yeah, how many people use Rancid? That's a pretty good percentage.
Of course I use it.
All right, so I'm Danny McPherson. Aaron Klink and I actually wrote a tool at a previous employer, and Aaron's pretty creative, so he named it Tool. Just a moment. One more. Oh, wait, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so it's much like Rancid. We weren't aware of Rancid at the time, and we needed a tool to do some automated stuff on the network, config diffs, monitor some things without a lot of really pretty graphical interfaces. Just do some basic stuff on the network. So it's written in Perl. It's got modules for different logins, like for for iOS versus GuneOS versus versus CatOS, for example. So it's pretty extensible from that front. You just write a new login module and interaction module for whatever CLI you're working with. Multi-vendor, it's Juniper, Cisco, Foundry. Others are added, I think, but I'm not sure a lot of them are posted currently. We haven't done a lot of work with this lately. Rancid's out there. We weren't attempting to displace anything. we were attempting to solve a problem that we had, which is what tool did for us. So, okay, so there we go. We've already talked about this, I think. All right, so we want to do basic monitoring stuff and pretty much be be flexible basically when there's something we want to do. If we want to find out how many routers in the network have a certain firmware revision on on slot 0 line card or all the line cards in the network, we could find that out in a matter of seconds basically. Without a lot of manual intervention. So that's kind of the problem that it solved for us. One of the problems to solve. So, okay, so there's basic CLI interaction. One of the things I did at a service provider, and I still do actually when I log into routers, is everything I do in a router is recorded to a log file somewhere. That way when something crashes and they say, well, did you save any of the output, you always have that. And so you could use this to do that. I had other scripts that did that for me at the time, but this could provide that functionality. If you wanted to just execute a command on a router, you could, CLI based, or, from a shell, say, tool will execute this command on that device, and it would do it for you. So it's pretty easy. Diffing configs was really important. I was in the architecture group, and we had engineering and operations engineering. There were a lot of people touching routers, especially in a network that was being built out new, and we needed tools to operationalize that for us, and get a grip on what was being changed in the network and what was wrong and what was right and what's missed, that sort of thing. And so it provided that capability that config diffs did. That was probably the most useful function. Some of the other basic stuff were like CPU monitor, uptime monitor. So if a router rebooted or CPU was above a threshold that I wanted to look at, or some certain aspect of the CPU was above a threshold that I wanted to look at, I could do that and get alerts based on that. So, and then the mass config function is just basically based on a regular expression of the routers. It could be like 7507s or or M10s or GNOS, whatever regular expression you wanted from your host list. You would define some command to execute on all those routers or some function to perform. So. All right, so several tasks. This is a look at the interface. It's not real. I mean, it's not real pretty. It's just useful and pretty efficient. We haven't spent a lot of time productizing it because we don't care that much about it. Rancid's out there and it's useful, and there's not a lot to it. So if you see it as useful, feel free to use it. If you don't, that's fine too. So. But anyway, here's a look at the CLI, like say tool-command show version, and you can specify a set of routers you want to run it on, that sort of thing. So, and TFTP configs, TFTP, you could upgrade, specify different server names, tell it to download things, tell it to run a diff manually, which was one of the things that I always did. Was I would grab a fresh set of configs before anyone started maintenance on the network, and then after the maintenance was complete, I'd do a diff, and then you can make sure that nothing was really out of whack. You could execute other commands too, like grab the number of BGP path entries from all the routers in the network, and if there's some huge difference when you're done with that, then it's something you probably want to be aware of. So just doing those little things before you start maintenance provides a lot of benefit after the fact. So a really small example host list. We had hundreds and hundreds of routers where I worked, and IP addresses, whatever variables you want to put in there for each of the host names. We key off of the IP address, so you don't have to do a lot of DNS lookups, and then grab the host name from the device, and whatever you want to key off of from this front. This was just a simple example. You could add pretty much anything you want in there. So for your groups, and you could use regular expressions in this when you're executing commands. So config diff and config hash, or actually I'll just jump on to the next. It's pretty intuitive. This is a really simple one. The most useful, with this one, for example, when we started deploying a lot of Ceph stuff in our network, and we needed DCEF turned on GSRs, or something wasn't configured right, or forwarding packets, whatever it was, then if routers were deployed and Ceph got disabled, something like that, you get an email message. The only issue is that you have to look at these things. You can key off certain things and have special alerts come to you, whatever. I tended to look at them quite a bit and found a lot of problems in the network by just looking at config diffs. The other thing it does is it performs aggregate, so you could see like this access list 3 changed on 131 devices in the network, and those things are network-wide changes, and so something you'd certainly want to be aware of. So, all right, CPU monitor is pretty intuitive. I think monitor the primary CPU, context switching or interrupt, whatever it is you want to look at. So, all right, uptime mom. A lot of big networks that have lots of devices can't pull the routers quickly enough to realize, or they're not pulling for the right thing. And if you have routers crash on a regular basis for some bug or some kind of memory leak or whatever problem there is, then you can use this and say, oh wait, router rebooted here, let's go check it out. And uptime mom will actually do a show tech support and pull all the data if you wanted to do that after a router crashes, so you have it immediately after the fact. So that was kind of useful on that front. There was something else with this actually I wanted to mention. Oh well, anyway. Okay, mass config. All this basically does is you can have a command file. In this case, you can see I ran it locally, but you have a command file, and you say, this could be, an access list that's 1,000 lines long, whatever it is you want to push out. You could define your host list name if you have a specific host list you want to use for it, or define a class of devices and a debug function, and basically it'll push it out to all the routers in the network. The other thing that was really useful actually with the uptime mon and the CPU mon is it logs in. We use some SNMP stuff as well, and it reports if it can't get to a device. And typically before the NOC knew something was down, we'd start getting emails saying, "Hey, I can't get to this." Then it throttles back and starts sending those messages intermittently and says, "Hey, I can't get to this device," so you'd know a device was unreachable. So it kept a pretty good running list of what routers were reachable and what wasn't reachable in the network. I actually generated the host list that you saw earlier off of the ISS, the link state database. Just grab it in the router ID or router IP from the LSP packet. So if you have OSPF or something like that, it's generated dynamically, and then you don't remove anything. With the shell script, it's really trivial to do something like that, and so that you can keep your list updated with new additions, but remove old stuff only when you're certain that you're done with that IP address. Okay, comments source. It's on SourceForge, tool, sourceforge.net. Send an email to tool@aclink.cx. That's one of Aaron's domains, and he's got an account set up there. So if there's anything you want, we're not attempting to displace Rancid, and if there's lots of use in that, that's great. So if folks need to automate their configs. We found lots of problems in the network. From either after maintenance or maliciously configured routers that were injecting things into BGP or other things that we picked up with this immediately for anyone who looks at the diffs. And can be corrected more efficiently and more quickly. So one other thing I was going to talk about real quickly was the router audit tool. George Jones is right here. Actually, if you want to come to the mic for just a sec and say something about it. I already okayed this with Randy, so he's not going to tell you to sit down. So, but router audit tool is something that George and the CIS security folks are working on. I'll just defer to him here real quickly. It's something that all of you should have a look at. So.
Yeah, so the moral of the story I'm finding here is that people have problems and that we sort of do parallel implementations. So I'm going to echo the sentiments that were said earlier. If RAT works for you, use it. If Rancid works for you, use it. Tool works for you, use it. RAT was something that I used sort of at EUNet when I was doing web hosting stuff. I basically started out as a thing with, where's Rob Thomas? Rob, are you here? Yeah, right. Rob had these little great router config guides, and I took them and basically created a little thing that did greps for the things I wanted out of that. And it sort of grew and grew and grew, and now it's this thing. It's based on the originally it was based on the NSA router security configuration guide, just a rule set. And basically what it does is it checks for things, gives you HTML-ish reports, and you can group them however you want. Currently does iOS only. We've got work in progress to do Pix and Juniper as well. So.
Okay, and there's the URL again for that. And I think that's it for me. Yeah, that's it. Switch to yes, if you got slides or something.
Questions? Answers?
So, how many people in here actually operate routers, run routers, or responsible for that? Now, keep your hand up if you don't manage those routers automatically.
Define automatic.
Well, automated. Some config diffs, config downloads, something where a person doesn't have to log. Like you have cron jobs that take care of that for you. Liars. I know there are a lot of folks in here that don't. I probably said that backwards. I didn't want to embarrass anyone, so I probably saw a lot of hands go down because no one wants to say that. But I talk to a lot of service providers now, and I see a lot of folks that don't have tools in place to do this. And my basic statement would be that there's really no excuse. There's a lot of free stuff out there, and it saves a lot of headache if you do it before the fact. So.
These tools, how frequently do you poll routers or talk to routers with them?
With Rancid, you put it in cron, so it's as frequently as you want.
But what I'm asking is how frequently would people normally use these?
We've been doing it once an hour.
I've seen hours being common.
Okay.
And the the monitoring stuff, the things that are on me like VS and P, for example, are typically 5-minute intervals, something of that sort, 5-10 minute interval, depending on how long a run takes. So.
Okay. And the other question was, I know some of this stuff, like I think it's RAT specifically, does analysis of configs. the parts of these tools. These tools are like they're kind of multi-headed hydras. So this is specifically related to the parts of tools that analyze configs. Do any of these tools do this with offline copies of configs, or do they all require going on a live network, logging into live routers, and pulling out the config immediately prior to their analysis, or testing, or validation?
So yeah, so with our config diff stuff on tool, you can actually run that because it's a separate process, separate program. You can run it on anything you wanted. I don't know about the others. So.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks.
At the University of Wisconsin, we've gone through a similar thing, developed again our own tool, and been using it for about 5 years. And I think the interesting part about the aspect of this is the social work aspect. How do you change the operator's behavior so that they participate in a system? Because the holy grail here is like you can checkpoint as people are doing changes, and they can do a mass change and stamp it as all one thing. These things are common for programmers to do, and what I keep trying to retrofit this sort of programmer mentality onto operators. Have you had any success with that other than new green operators, or is the system always trying to discover what people already did instead of trying to get the person to tell other operators what they're doing as it gets put in the repository?
The best solution to that or success that I've had to that is to let the operators use the tools. When they realize that they don't have to, when they realize they don't have to log in themselves all the time, and they can write little wrappers and get a lot of this done quicker and easier, and have verification that they didn't mess up, then they see a benefit to it and they use it. If you just try and here's this tool verification generation device, they tend not to use it. But when they see this makes my job easier, this makes my life easier, then they use it, and then they start to give you more feedback on what you want. Now, I originally wrote the tool when I was an operator, so it was easier at that point to roll it out to the other operators because, well, we were all in the team together, and hey, look, this makes life easier. But even when I moved into engineering and management and other stuff, it was easy to roll out if you showed the benefit.
But this is programmer mentality stuff. Operators, the NOC is overloaded, the NOC is da-da-da-da, and it's the classic problem of I'll lose 10 minutes today, don't tell me it'll save me 10 years next month. But this also has a little bit of appeal to senior management, which is having a whole bunch of people making mistakes at keyboards all day, every day, costs the company a lot of money. Okay, and you ask a simple question when last month's or last quarter's or whatever it was, Cisco's bug was there, and you had to install something on all your routers. How many people did it take how many hours? And with a company whose routers are configured automatically, it was measured in minutes for hundreds of routers. And that kind of rings a bell with people paying the bills. How you trickle that down to the people actually sitting at the keyboards is another matter. It's programmer mentality versus keyboard jockey mentality, and that's been a war since the early 60s when I got into this field. Next.
Okay, quick question. A lot of times...
Yeah, but who are you?
Joel Krauska. I now work with Cisco. In my previous lives, I worked for some now defunct providers. At all of those providers, we had to have a backdoor password for automatic login to work because we implemented S-key. Are there solutions now that allow you to use an S-key login into your passwords to get the rancid or equivalent information?
Not S-key, but SSH, of course.
S-key with SSH, or are you using
No,
SSH as a...
SSH straight.
But you're still going to have the same authentication user and password allowed if you still have to enable Telnet.
No, you don't. SSH, you do not have to enable Telnet. I'm pretty sure. I could go read up on it on the web to make sure.
Okay. But are there people using S-key with rancid in some functional?
No, because you can't do a one-time pad.
Well, not really. We are using something quite similar to rancid, and we have S-key authentication, and we also can do mass configurations with ASCII on the routers. Can be done.
Who are you, Rudiger?
Rüdiger Volk, Deutsche Telekom.
Okay, can you share how you do that?
Could you, that was Danny asking, could you share how you do that?
Well, the process that is driving each, that is going to drive each session on the router has to, of course, request an authentication, and that process keeps the secret and reuses it on each subsequent session that it uses.
So
of course,
all
if
your
you,
routers are in sync on their one-time pads?
well, the routers don't have each one their separate authentication base. They actually go back to a single server that supplies the authentication service, which is a scheme which is not completely unknown in other parts of the world.
Next.